Welcome back to the Vandy Sports Podcast of the 440 Sports Network. I'm your host, Joey Dwyer, and we've got a special guest today and a guest that will be joining us a good bit down the stretch here covering basketball. We've added another contributor, and it's one that Billy, Elena, Chris, and I are really excited about. Brandon Bigsby, my good friend from Lipscomb, a guy who knows this program just about as well as anybody. Brandon, thank you for coming on and tell us about yourself. Tell us why you thought this was the right move for you to come with us.
Yeah, Joey, thank you for having me. I am beyond stoked to be a part of everything with Vandy Sports. You guys have been nothing but amazing with covering just everything that goes on, and not just basketball, but with football and baseball and everything else. I just couldn't help but to jump at this opportunity when it came up, just to be able to be a part of just amazing coverage and be able to contribute to that, to a program like Vanderbilt, a program that I grew up watching. I was born and raised here in Nashville. My mom graduated from Vanderbilt. I basically grew up in Memorial Gym. Me and my dad would go to men's basketball games all the time, all the way back when you had guys like Shane Foster and Derek Byers playing, and really what a lot of fans, I think, kind of go back and think of some of the prime days of the program. So just to be able to kind of help and contribute to coverage over there for such a great organization, and almost also a bit on the women's basketball side as well, it just felt like really a match made in heaven. So very blessed and grateful to be a part of it and have this opportunity to work with you guys.
For sure. I think Brandon's a guy that Elena and I particularly have been pushing for a long time to join us. He's play-by-play guy by trade, but I think we'll do a good job in this role. Brandon, we don't know exactly what your role is going to be, but I think we're going to make you a focal point of basketball coverage in some way. So we're super excited about that, and hopefully it'll help you with your play-by-play too.
Yeah, man. Like I said, I'm always willing to learn and dip my toe into different things. I've been able to do some writing as well on the basketball and sports side over for Lipscomb for their student media, and as well as over on the esports side as well. So, like you said, a play-by-play guy typically by trade. I do a lot of that over there, but also been able to do some writing as well in the past. So really excited to get things started and can't wait to see how things go, man. I am so stoked for it.
For sure. I think Brandon's enthusiasm will stand out at you. And it's not hot take enthusiasm, it's just general love for the game, I think. And that'll come through pretty well. But Brandon, I think we're gonna see that a little bit today. We're gonna talk basketball, and we'll give you a little bit of an easier topic to start, but we're gonna talk about how a Mark Byington team is different and kind of the staples of a Mark Byington team, what Vanderbilt fans should expect. And that's kind of something I made a point to him to ask at the introductory press conferences. What do you want your team to look like? And what do you want to kind of stand out about it? And he talked a lot about how he wants his team to attack, and he wants his team just to kind of be the aggressor in a lot of ways and play fast and be a fun team to watch. So I think this will be an episode that Vanderbilt fans like. But before we do that, Brandon, are you dreading laundry day?
Yeah, it is taking up a little bit too much of my time recently now that I kind of get to thinking about it. So, yeah, I
Right.
actually am kind of dreading. I need to get to it soon.
Right. It is stealing the time to do the things you truly enjoy. Let the laundry professionals take care of that for you, though, Brandon. Just drop off your dirty laundry, and our professional attendants can give you back the one thing you can never have enough of, which is your time. Within 24 hours, you can pick up your nicely folded, fresh, and clean laundry ready to be put away. Check out www.washhouseclean.com. Stop in a day and get your time back. Brandon, I know you've heard that read a million times, but the Wash House has really been a focal point for us, something that's really helped us out over the course of the season. It was a rough season, but I don't know if we could have got through it without the Wash House. But it feels like brighter days are ahead for Vanderbilt basketball, Brandon, with the Mark Byington era kind of kicking off. And we've seen a lot about the portal and the type of guy they're recruiting. But what sticks out to you about a Mark Byington coach team? I know you've watched a lot of James Madison. What are kind of the staples of a Byington team from your estimation?
I think the number one thing, as you mentioned, just the pace. And I don't even think that's just necessarily in terms of running up and down the floor as much as it is about movement on the offensive side of the ball. And I think that was something that a lot of times when watching Vanderbilt over the last couple of seasons kind of lacked a little bit. I think that even during pressers, you would hear Stack talk about a little bit the ball sticking too much with certain guys. And that was something that felt like a bit of an issue with Vanderbilt's offenses over the last few years. And I think even before Stack with Bryce Drew, that would sometimes be a little bit more of an issue, was the ball sticking a little bit too much and not having as much movement on ball or even off ball movement as well. I mean, when you go back and just look at some of James Madison's games, even before this tournament run season that they just had, there is constantly someone to look at when you're watching their games. There's constantly backdoor cuts. There's guys moving around on the opposite side where the ball is. There's just a lot of things going on, a lot of different sets of movements that you have to kind of deal with as a defense when you're playing a team like this. And, again, that does cause a lot of work to look at when you are a fan, but it makes it so exciting to watch. So I think just being able to see an offense that is very free flowing is going to be very refreshing, probably for a lot of fans, even if things aren't necessarily as high in on the winning to start out, just because this is a first year head coach in the SEC. It's going to be an adjustment for him. It's going to be an adjustment for a team that has not really had much experience together. But in terms of the brand of basketball, it's going to be very eye popping in terms of the pace, in terms of the movement. There's constantly going to be something to look at, and something that Vanderbilt was known for during his prime days was the ability to shoot the three. That's something that Mark Byington teams love to do, and they've been able to do it very well. Vanderbilt last season was ranked in the 340s in 3-point percentage, bottom 25 nationally. So I feel like a lot of the things that fans kind of clamored for with a lot of the old offenses, even before Stackhouse, I think they're going to see shades of that with this Byington team. And that's something I think that a lot of people watching can really get excited over when they think about the upcoming months here.
For sure. I think tempo is something we need to talk about, and I'm glad you touched on that. Brandon, they're going to be a lot faster. James Madison was 74th in tempo in the country last year. Felt like it was even a little bit faster than that. If you watch their tournament game against Wisconsin, I don't know how much they're actually getting into the half court. I think they were really successful in that game because they were able to get out and run so much. And I think maybe the most exciting part of that at Vanderbilt is that they're going to have a lot better guards than they had at James Madison. It was interesting. They weren't necessarily a guard-driven team. Terrence Edwards was more of a wing. Their 2 point guards, I think, did what Byington needed them to do. But now that they have a guy like AJ Hogarth and Jason Edwards to kind of run the show, they could probably even play faster than they played at James Madison. I think that's a really exciting thing. If you look at their tempo versus Vandy, which was 200 in tempo last year, James Madison was 74th. Pretty drastic difference. And I like that you brought up kind of the movement and the free flowingness of the offense, because I think that's going to be something as well. I think they're going to run a lot less sets, and maybe they'll have, I don't know if they're going to have a similar amount to Stackhouse in the playbook, because I think Stack had more than just about anybody around the sport, but I think they're going to be a lot more free flowing. Like you said, I think they're probably going to call some actions, and they're probably going to call some sets. I don't think it's completely throw the ball over the fence like Bryce Drew got the perception of being at times, but I do think they're going to look to run first, and then if they're in the half court, then they're maybe going to set something up. But I think he's going to put it in his guys' hands, and I think kind of the overwhelming takeaways I've gotten from Mark Byington offense is that he's going to let his playmakers make plays, and I think a lot of the thing with a Stackhouse offense over the years was metrically they're getting a good shot, but I don't know that it's necessarily a great shot, right? Is a three from a guy who's a low 30s shooter off of a pin down that's pretty open, a good shot. Say for a Malik Presley, if you're running a pin down from Malik Presley and he's wide open, statistically it's a good shot, right? But I don't know that that's necessarily the shot you want down the floor. You probably want to put it in Magnon or Lawrence's hands or something along those lines, rather than having maybe a Colin Smith three where he's still kind of moving after coming off a screen. It's just kind of food for thought that they're putting it in their guys' hands, and it's going to be a lot more on them than I feel like it was with Stackhouse. I think Stackhouse wanted a little bit more control over the game than Byington does, and that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing, because I think he did run good stuff for a lot of the time. But also, I think it's going to be a much different look in terms of Byington's trusting his guys a little bit more.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, especially with the play calling, because I know as easy as it may be for some Vanderbilt fans to kind of dunk on Stackhouse a little bit with how things went, that's one thing that he was always really heralded for, was his ability to draw up plays. And I think that was something that if you go and ask any coach in the SEC which coach they feel like is the best at being able to draw up true sets, one of the first names that would come out of their mouth probably was Jerry Stackhouse. That is one thing he was very good at being able to do. And I think that there were some benefits to running an NBA style offense, but the thing about it is that it's so much harder to run that in the college game, because you are dealing with college athletes. You're not necessarily coaching with NBA level players. The play style there is just so much different than what it is in the college game. And I feel like that kind of went against Stackhouse's philosophy a little bit in terms of the way he liked to coach schematically, while this offense feels like it is a little bit more free flowing. It does give players a little bit more of that freedom with the ball. And, I think that that's going to really go into the advantage, especially in some of the players that he was able to recruit and bring over. So, I don't want to say Stackhouse's offense was more limited necessarily, but I do think it was a lot more textbook by what he drew. This Byington offense, I think, can probably really bring the best out in a lot of these guys that want to kind of have that ability to get slightly creative when they have the ball in their hands. And that's something that can be a benefit for them. And you mentioned that tempo stat. That was something that Vanderbilt struggled with. And you saw it in the possessions per game, too. JMU was top 50 in possessions per game out of anyone in the country. Vanderbilt was ranked in the 230s. So a lot of that tempo and a lot of that pace gives them the opportunity to also get more shots so they can kind of defend well on the other end, too. So I think a lot of the stats show the differences in the way those two coach offensively. And I also think that players will be a little bit more, not necessarily excited, but I do think it gives them a lot more freedom and a lot more to play with in terms of being able to make things happen outside of just having to stick specifically to what is drawn up to them.
Right. And I think something worth noting too is you mentioned the NBA style thing. I think Stack's an NBA guy, right? So he ran NBA stuff. But I also think the modern NBA maybe has gotten a little bit away from that. I think a lot of the modern NBA is you put the ball in one of your best guys' hands, you put him in a ball screen, you let him make a play. And I think that's a lot of what they pitched to AJ Hogard when they recruited him. AJ Hogard has made it no secret he wants to be an NBA player. And they said, we're going to put you in ball screens, we're going to let you make decisions, and you're going to have an opportunity to be free in this offense. And I think that's something worth noting too. In some ways, it also feels like an NBA offense, right? It's not, and Stack obviously ran NBA stuff, but it almost feels like the newer school kind of NBA style is fitting to Byington's scheme and kind of what they want to do with maybe empowering their players a little more by giving them more autonomy in the offense.
Yeah, and I think that's also something that when you go and talk to recruits, it's a lot easier to sell probably than saying that it is the traditional NBA offense. Because, like you said, nowadays in the NBA, especially on a lot of these top end teams, it is give the ball to your best player, get him off of a ball screen, and let him go make the play that he best see fit. And I think you did see that a little bit from Stackhouse over the years. I think there's a reason that a lot of time his point guard was the best player on that team, the most effective player on that team. You even go back to year one, Saban Lee's best year statistically was with Jerry Stackhouse, where he was able to have the ball in his hand, get off of a screen, either take it and drive or pass it out for a spray, which they absolutely love to do. That was a vast majority of where their sets came from. And then it was Scottie Pippen Jr., then it was Tyron Lawrence, and then last year it kind of became Ezra Manjon when Lawrence struggled. So I think you did see a little bit of that, but just in a more limited way with Stackhouse. I think with this offense, it'll be some of those similar concepts, but a lot more movement off the ball. I feel like a lot of times there would be certain sets to where you would have, say, Tyron Lawrence going off of a screen from Van Allen Lubin, and then outside of Van Allen Lubin trying to roll to the post, you would have three other guys kind of standing around the corner just waiting for a shot. There wouldn't be a whole lot of movement outside of those two. So I think that's something that's going to look a lot different with this Vanderbilt team. It's going to create more mismatches potentially, and it's going to make defenses have to look out for more as well, because it's a little bit easier to defend when you're only having to worry about one or two guys on a certain possession compared to guys constantly moving around off the ball, on ball screens and things of that nature.
For sure. I'm glad you brought that up too, because I think Scottie Pippen Jr. is a good example of that as well, to where Stack would kind of just let Scottie Pippen Jr. go to work, and that was probably the right decision at the time. Um, but also, I tend to remember there being a few games late where people were upset that Scottie Pippen Jr. didn't have the ball when he needed to have the ball, or he gave it off. And I don't think that's necessarily what you're going to see from a Byington team. I think it's going to be his best guy going to work, and they're going to probably get a good shot as a result of that. And I think Stackhouse teams a lot of the time featured good guards, but also I don't know if they had a whole lot of consistency in terms of what they were doing outside of their best guy. I think as we move to the rotation, it's going to be a lot different, Brandon. I think Vanderbilt's rotation, inconsistent to say the best, or to say the least this year. They had 13 guys play over 10 minutes a game. Some of those guys at the back end of the rotation who played over 10 minutes a game had 4 or 5 games they didn't appear in when they were healthy scratches, which kind of tells you about the level of consistency they had. You look 2 years ago, Liam Robbins, Jordan Wright, Ezra Manjon coming off the bench for whatever reason. And I'm not sure I can get my head around that. But if you look at James Madison, and that's just kind of Stack's style. It's not necessarily for better or for worse. I know it bothered fans, just kind of how he operated, though. James Madison in 2023-24 had 7 guys average over 20 minutes a game and play in all 36 games. Dalen Carey played 14 minutes per game and played in, I think, all 36. And another guy played 35 games at 8 minutes a game. So it's probably going to be consistently 8 or 9. And it seems like it's going to be the same 8 or 9 guys. And then you look at the starting lineup. Friedel, Edwards, and Wooden started every single game. Bickerstaff started all but one. So there's 4 essentially every game starters, and the last spot rotated between 2 guards who were very similar players. So you've got 6 guys who I think started a game. Maybe they had 7, but it's pretty consistently the same 4 or 5 guys, which I think is a good sign. And I think the rotation is going to be a lot different, but maybe not for better or for worse. It is interesting to consider all the depth they have this year and how that all fits, but I tend to think that they're going to have a more consistent group, and that is certainly going to help with them having a lot of transfers. I think it's going to help having guys who are more familiar with each other and kind of know what to expect game to game.
Yeah, and I think that's something I'm really interested to watch, especially during probably the first 5 to 10 games of non-conference play. And this is something that Coach Stackhouse got a lot of flack for by fans, was just how much he would really rotate the lineups very often, especially the starting lineups, how much he would kind of play around with things. It felt like at times it was kind of hard to get really a grasp on what 5 would roll out game to game. And I think you kind of saw that in a lot of the different names that you saw start. I mean, you look at a guy like Jordan Williams, for example, who averaged 10 and a half minutes in 27 games, but it felt like he started about half of them last year. And he would start over guys like Tyron Lawrence at times. He would start like guys over Evan Taylor or like Jason Rivera Torres, that a lot of people thought like they would probably be just, permanent pieces of that lineup come conference play. And it just never really happened that way for him. Well, like you mentioned, for Coach Byington, he typically will roll with the same 4 or 5 guys. I think in some ways, and I know you and I are a little bit more familiar with this program than maybe some others that are watching, it kind of feels like Coach Byington coaches similarly to Lenny Acuff at Lipscomb in some ways. Typically, it's going to be a similar 4 or 5 that are starting. There's more of a kind of 5-out look a lot of times offensively, to where there's a lot of slips, a lot of backdoor cuts, a lot of ball movement. It's a very guard-heavy offense, to where there's going to be a lot of responsibility on the 1 and 2. And I mean, I think it's going to be a lot of fun to watch that from Vanderbilt, because, I mean, we'll talk about it plenty throughout the next few months, but you just look at the guys that they have at those positions with AJ Hogard, with Jason Edwards coming in as a transfer from North Texas. There is so much to work with at those positions, and it's going to be a lot of fun to kind of see how Coach Byington really crafts that perfect lineup, especially once we do get kind of closer to that conference play in December and January.
For sure. The word that comes to my mind with the rotation of the starting lineup is tighter. And that's just really what I've come back to throughout the whole time. I think Stack had a really loose rotation. You see, he'll play walk-ons over other guys to send a message or because he wants a different look. I don't think Byington's necessarily going to do that. I think he's going to establish his guys and he's going to trust his guys. And it's not going to be a Mike Bray solid 7 to where they're not going to change and he's going to be completely stubborn based on matchups. If I had to guess, I would guess there's going to be a little more flexibility than that, but it's certainly not going to be the look that Vanderbilt fans had last year. And I think that makes the position battles all the more interesting, because if obviously a guy can come back in the winter and practice well and get in the rotation, but I think this summer is really important for a lot of guys, especially considering a lot of the depth they have. You look at a guy like Grant Huffman. How does he fit in? How does Tyler Tanner fit in? How does Chris Mannon fit in? I think Chris Mannon's probably going to be a guy who plays a lot, but they've got a lot of guys at the wing. What about Alex Hemingway, who Mark Byington called one of the best shooters in the country and really wanted to make a point that he's not just a shooter. So I think there's a lot here with the position battles, and I think the rotation being a little bit tighter makes that all the more interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's going to make probably these next few months over the summer really, really interesting as well. Probably more interesting than what we've seen maybe since that season a couple of years ago, where you had guys like Liam Robbins come in and Miles Studi was coming off of that really strong freshman season that he had. Like, that's probably the last time I think you can come in this summer with so much excitement about what the lineup is going to look like. And just because, as you mentioned, there are so many different pieces now that hadn't played together before, can do a lot of different things that Coach Byington and his staff have talked really, really highly of. I mean, and that's the thing when you have that many options, when you have that type of depth, it just makes it that much more intriguing. I mean, you didn't even mention it, all of the guys. I mean, you look at a guy like NJ Collins, another guard that they've
Mhm.
spoken very highly of, didn't necessarily play the best during the first half of the season, but was one of Virginia Tech's best players during the second portion of the season in the postseason. You look at Devin McLaughlin at the forward spot, a guy that has come in and has kind of grown over the years, comes from Boston College, a guy like Tyler Nickel as well that you expect to play a lot. So there's a lot of different options for them to kind of mess around with here. And you can't even forget one of the few returners, a guy like JQ Roberts. How does he fit into this whole thing? And he was a guy that I think showed a good bit of growth despite more limited playing time. And I think that Coach Sackhouse really did believe in, especially down the stretch as he continued to get better. But there's just a lot of options. And I think that this summer, kind of waiting and seeing who looks good, who looks like they're fitting in and adjusting to the system quickly, things like that are going to be what a lot of fans are really going to look to keep their ear to the ground on, because there are so many new pieces and there's so many guys that don't just do different things, but guys that can come in and pretty much contribute day one. It's not like these are freshmen coming in. A lot of these guys are transfers that have a lot of experience. Vanderbilt, in terms of experience rating, is top 25 in the country in terms of games played with the lineups that they have next year. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see kind of how all of this forms and to see what sorts of lineups Coach Byington kind of plays around with early in the year and seeing how that grows into more of a consistent look, like you mentioned.
For sure, Brandon. I'm glad you brought up JQ Roberts. His game against Florida with 7 offensive rebounds and 0 defensive rebounds will live in infamy. I think that's an all-time incredible stat line.
Yeah, it's very rare, and I think the JQ Rob. I mean, he's a guy that where I think you saw some of the flashes last year. Something that I know, Coach Stackhouse probably did get some flack for, and is something that I think could make or break Mark Byington's tenure, because he even said it: the system's not going to work without good players.
Mhm.
JQ Roberts, I think, was a guy that did show a lot of potential last year, and you might not necessarily see it in the stats. He played 13.4 minutes per game in 26 games. He only averaged 2.3 rebounds, 2.3 points, but he is a guy that I think he did a lot of the things that don't show up in the stat sheet. Just being able to be where he's supposed to be positionally, being able to get in those dirty areas and create extra possessions, which is something that Vanderbilt really did struggle with. And you saw JQ Roberts saw an uncomfortable position. He was forced to play in the five a lot of times when guys like Van Allen Lubin got into foul trouble. You could tell they really missed guys like QMB and Liam Robbins last year. And then obviously Lee Dort only playing the one game for the things that happened out of the court. So he was forced in a bit of a tougher position. I think that having that position battle with a guy like Carey is going to be really valuable for him. I'm excited to see how he grows, because again, he is the one returning piece to this team. So he's a guy that I don't think the Vanderbilt fans can forget about. I know it's going to be kind of easy to with all of the guys that are coming in, and especially at all those different positions with so much turnover. But I think he's someone that Mark Byington believes in. There's a reason that JQ Roberts is still on the team. It could have been easy in, this new age of college basketball to tell him it might be best for you to find another spot. I think Mark Byington sees a role for him. So he's someone that I'm really interested to kind of see where his role in this team ends up fitting and how Byington uses them as well.
For sure. I'm glad you brought him up because I want to talk a lot about recruiting and development down the stretch here. I think JQ Roberts is an example of the type of guy Stack wanted to recruit, kind of a guy who does the dirty work really well. And I think he's kind of a microcosm of what Stack decided to do the last year. And I think this would have been different had Stack come back for this year because I think he would have realized the need to adapt. But as everybody kind of zigged towards the transfer portal, Stack zagged towards high school recruiting. You saw that massive class they brought in last year with Malik Presley, Carter Lang, JQ Roberts, Isaiah West. Brandon, when you look at that class, there's a lot of guys in there and a lot of guys who are not still with Vanderbilt for a multitude of reasons. And I think a lot of that is a result of Mark Byington saying he has to have better players to win. And you saw what that class being a focal point did for that group. It wasn't a super highly touted class. And add Jason Veratore's in there, I think that's a worthwhile note. I think he's probably a guy that they would have liked to move forward with. But you look at it and you say, look at Carter Lang. What stands out about Carter Lang? One thing, his rebounding. Isaiah West, his defense and intensity. I guess that's one or two things. Jason Rivera Torres, his playmaking off the bounce stands out in his length defensively, but not a great defender. So really does one or two things well. J.K. Roberts' athleticism really stood out, and I think he's maybe developed a little bit more. But when they recruited him, it felt like he was a one-trick pony of sorts, but I think had potential to do more. And then Malik Presley, his athleticism stood out, and I think they thought he'd be a better shooter than he was. All that to say, it felt like they were kind of taking swings on guys doing one thing really well and thinking that they could develop the rest of it. And I don't think this staff thinks that way. I think they want more complete products. Mark Byington talked to us in the spring and said he wants guys who have been at the college level, who have proven that they can do some things at the college level and who have done some things. And I think that's a big difference from the recruiting philosophy last offseason, to where they thought maybe they could be a little bit smarter than everybody else by taking advantage of maybe some under recruited high school guys and developing them. That's not really the sense I get from this staff. I think they're going to try to recruit guys who are more highly touted, and I think they're going to do what's needed to be able to get those guys. And I have some questions as to whether the previous staff did that. I know Chris Lee talked to Stack back in the day, and he said other teams are going to work harder for us in recruiting because we want guys who want to be here. And not to say that any of Vanderbilt's current guys don't want to be here, but I think a lot of those guys were not going out of their way to come to Vanderbilt. The staff had to get them here. And I think all that to say, the philosophy on the portal and on recruiting in general is much different. And I've tried to give Stack some benefit of the doubt here, but I think Byington's philosophy a lot more applicable in this day and age of college basketball. And maybe Stack would have transitioned this offseason if he would have returned. I heard that they were going to make NIL a big focus. If he would have returned, and he would have been kind of at the forefront of changing the philosophy. But we saw Stack change the philosophy a few times, and it didn't necessarily work out. I think Byington and his staff want to develop, but their recruiting philosophy seems to be a lot different, Brandon.
Yeah, and I think that you really kind of see that in just the way that they were able to get guys in. A lot of it was through the portal, and some of that obviously by force. It's going to be tough to bring in recruits when you just get hired in late March. And keep in mind, Mark Byington was just off the heels of an NCAA tournament run and then took that job, I think 5 or 6 days after JMU season ended. So, it was going to be tough to really get in any impact freshmen by that point that were going to come in. Most of these guys are pretty much locked in by February. So it was going to be tough to be able to do that. But like you mentioned, I think he's looking for a lot of guys that he knows can kind of come in and make an impact. Well, I think for Coach Stackhouse and his staff, I think he was a little bit more content with a slower bird and kind of relying on his older guys to pick up the slack from there, while those other guys that were freshmen kind of simmered a little bit and were able to gain experience. And I think we really saw that catch up to him this year when you saw guys like Jordan Wright, like Miles Studi, like Liam Robbins, Quinn Melora Brown end up leaving. That really did hurt them because it forced them to rely more on some of those younger guys, as well as some transfers that I think they were hoping to have a bit more of an impact from. I think Evan Taylor, they thought they were going to get a little bit more from than what they did. I think losing Colin Smith early in the season obviously hurt them. Tyron Lawrence's play, I think it would be naive to not say that he took a big step back last season compared to during his junior year. Paul Lewis, I think they thought was going to get a step forward. And I think that they also thought that some of those freshmen that they did get would be able to make a bigger impact than what they did. I think they thought that guys like Isaiah West and guys like Carter Lang were going to be able to make a bit of a bigger leap in that first year than what they anticipated. And you don't want to say that they put all of their eggs in one basket necessarily, but I do think that the bets that they did put in just didn't necessarily hit as much as they thought that they would. And that was going to be a tough position for them when you had so many guys leave the program, whether it was to the NBA or to the transfer portal, that really were high impact guys. And that did hurt them. A lot of the recruiting the last few years didn't necessarily stick well either. No one from the 22 class or 21 class rather ended up coming back after that 1 year there. The 22 class didn't necessarily hit in the way they thought. Noah Shelby didn't really give a lot of the contribution they thought. Malik Dia wasn't great in his limited time at Vanderbilt. Obviously has been amazing in Belmont. Now is going over to Ole Miss. It just felt like a lot of the investments that Stackhouse staff ended up making didn't really turn out to the extent that they thought that it really would. And I think that's what's really probably going to make or break Mark Byington's tenure is who do you really invest in as recruits and in the transfer portal, and what do you get out of them? Because it felt like even when you did see, and it's not to say that Stackhouse's tenure was a failure in terms of developing guys. Tyler Lawrence got infinitely better. Then Alan Lubin last year, I think, was a good example of a guy that came and was not to the level of what he was when he left. Now he's at North Carolina and one of the best teams in the country. So it's not to say they didn't totally develop. I think that to the level that you would need for a team like this in one of the best conferences in college basketball, it wasn't necessarily to that level. And that's really what's going to make or break this next coaching staff, I feel like.
Yeah, and I think you saw that when Byington took the job. I don't know that it's any secret that Byington was not happy with the current state of the roster and moved on from some of those guys, which Stackhouse did, and I had a bit of an issue with because I think he had kind of convinced guys they were going to be focal points of the future of the program. It's a little different with the coaching change, but I think they're a lot more serious about talent. And I think the last staff thought they were going to be able to develop their way into NCAA tournaments, and they weren't. Brandon, I've only got a few minutes left on my Zoom call, so make this answer a little bit quicker. What do you sense the identity is going to be of a Mark Byington team? Because I think when Stack always talked about he wanted to be defensive oriented, I think that meant they were maybe willing to muck a little bit more, a little bit more. I don't know. It wasn't going to be as pretty as a Mark Byington offense and team is meaning to be. Is that kind of the sense you've gotten as well?
Yeah, I would say so. And I think that really the difference too is that Stackhouse's tenure was kind of more defined by the playbook and the plays were going to be ran by that. I think that if there's one word I could describe as this Byington tenure is going to be on the floor, it's probably free flowing. We've talked about that a lot. It's not to say that it doesn't have structure. It's very much a structured offense, but I just think that there's a lot of more options for creativity for players. There's a lot more for them to choose from. I think that there won't be necessarily those times where if a player deviates from a play that might be more frowned upon, because I think that with Coach Stackhouse and that staff, they kind of like your guys to stay more to the play and what the design of that was. Well, for Coach Byington and his staff, I think that he probably gives a little bit more room for creativeness in terms of what he feels like his best players are able to do. If Jason Edwards feels like he can make a play, then I think there's going to be more room for him to do that outside of what's drawn up for him. So I think just a free flowing offense and an eye popping offense, that's going to be what I think the biggest difference is in between these two when you look at them head to head.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up recruiting earlier because I think that's a great recruiting pitch as well. And I think that's a lot of what the previous staff was missing. I think the word got out at the end that that's not really an offense or a culture you want to play in. I don't think Byington's offense necessarily has that vibe to it. And it's going to be really interesting after this year to see how much they can retain because I think that tells you a lot about the culture that they built. And I think that's going to be something that is important. I do have some indicators though that it's going to be a positive culture. I've heard a lot of good things about the staff recruiting. I've heard a lot of good things about their connection with former players and their connection with the community. We've seen that with them going to the tailgate, with them having a relationship with Will Purdue. I think they're, and I use this word a lot, it's kind of coach speak, they're about the right things to this point, and we'll see if there's evidence to that in the spring. But I have some reason to feel pretty good about where this thing is heading, Brandon. And as we kind of wrap up, just feels like they're in a much better spot than they were this time a year ago. And if they are successful with NIL and the new practice facility being such a focal point, feels like it's going to be a little more sustainable under this model than it was under the previous model.
Yeah, and if there's one thing that I feel like that Mark Byington, when you hear that term, like he just gets it, I feel like that's the part that he really gets more than what a lot of people in college basketball do, is that he just gets it in terms of just the pureness of the sport and his ability to be able to connect with fans. I mean, you saw directly after the press conference, the first thing he did was go over to a frat house with a bunch of students and introduce himself to them and say that there's going to be some big changes and we're excited to bring you guys here. It feels like he's really kind of united and bridged a bit of a gap between the fan base and the program that's been there. Honestly, I think you could even say it's been there since Kevin Stallings last year. That's a big reason that Kevin Stallings wasn't retained, is because there were a lot of people in the fan base that weren't really happy with him necessarily. And then with Bryce Drew, a great guy. I think there was some of that unity there, but when you're not able to win consistently, that kind of draws some of that back. And then with Jerry Stackhouse, if there was one critique I would have of him, I think there was probably a bit of a lack of understanding of that. Is just how to connect the fan base with the program. how to be, I guess, more personable. And he would tell you he was very personable. He would kind of joke around about that in pressers, but I think that if he gave us a little bit more of what we saw during that last press conference against Arkansas at the SEC tournament, fans probably would have been a little bit more drawn to him than what they were. So I think that Mark Byington gets it. It takes culture building. It takes bridging that gap between the program and former players, program and the fan base. And he's done an excellent job of that after just a few months. And if you combine the winning with that memorial magic that you hear talked about from back in the 2000s and then the 90s and in the early 2010s could come back very quickly because that connection with program and fan base is coming back again slowly but surely.
For sure. I think you summed it up well. And Brandon, you killed it on your first podcast. I think people finally have heard what we've talked about after class for forever. I think this is, if you come to Lipscomb in the sports media building and you walk out in the hallway, you'll probably see this podcast happening 15 different times. So,
Yeah.
Brandon, great work. And anything else you want to say on your first Vandy Sports podcast? It certainly will not be your last.
Hey, just a thank you again for having me. Thank you to Chris and everyone for bringing me in and making me feel welcome. And, hopefully everyone listening enjoyed. Hopefully I made a good first impression. So excited to contribute more to these and excited to talk more Vanderbilt basketball. I promise you guys, I probably could have talked for 2 more hours easily. So definitely excited for the future and excited to keep doing these.
For sure. I'm excited to have Brandon, a good friend of mine, like I mentioned, a guy who's got a tremendous future in this business, whatever avenue he chooses. So we'll see where that takes him. But I think me, him, and Billy are going to aim for a weekly show at some point. Maybe during football, that's going to be a little more difficult. But for the rest of the summer, hopefully that'll be the aim. I'm glad to talk basketball with some guys. It's nice to have you two on board. And Brandon will be doing a lot of work with Elena as well on the women's side, which I'm excited about, kind of expanding that portion of our coverage as well. So thank you guys for watching. Thank you to the Wash House for sponsoring us and allowing us to make stuff like this possible. And God bless. Thank you all for watching. We'll talk soon. Peace.